The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus heard that Herod had beheaded John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, Jesus saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Our readings today are good news, filled with hope now and for the future. And it's sorely needed because we're still struggling through this pandemic and, ups and downs. Now we have to wear face masks indoors and who knows what's coming next. So we were due for good news. It kicks off with that second reading, with the question, what can separate us from the love of God? And St. Paul's answer is nothing. And then he goes through a whole list of possibilities. Neither death nor life, angels or demons, present or future, height nor depth, hardship, danger, nakedness, sword, persecution. Nothing will separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Now notice he does not mention in that list sin, because he knows sin can separate us from God. And he'll deal with that in his letter to the Galatians, where he'll have a list of serious sins. But here, we're talking about a person who is in sanctifying grace, which is us. Now, what's his rationale for making such a bold statement? It's the first reading. Because in that first reading from Isaiah chapter 55, we have this great invitation to a banquet, a saving banquet of rich foods. And actually, it goes back to Isaiah chapter 25. Now, the prophet Isaiah lived in the 8th century BC, so hundreds of years before the birth of Christ. And yet, God gave him this revelation, and it was God's desire that we know this, that God has planned for us this wonderful banquet of rich foods. And so Isaiah chapter 25 says, quote, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will provide for all people a rich food, fine wines, where every tear will be wiped away, every sin removed, the shame of people will be wiped away. And on that day people will say, 'See, this is our God. This is the one we hoped for. This is the one who saved us. We are glad.'" Now, it's a future vision of heaven, but there are several steps along the way. One of them is our first reading, because there, in chapter 55, Isaiah makes an explicit invitation to this banquet. And it's to everyone, without exception. Come to the banquet, all who thirst. Come without price, without cost. It's free. And delight yourselves in rich food. Now, this banquet he's referring to has 2 aspects to it, as we see in that first reading. First of all, it's a banquet of his word, because it says, "Incline your ear and listen so that you may live." And this is pointing forward to Jesus Christ, who will give us that rich wisdom in his teaching, beginning with the Sermon on the Mount. But the second aspect is this covenant that he mentions, an eternal covenant. And what's that referring to? We hear it again, that word covenant, in the New Testament when Jesus in the upper room on Holy Thursday, institutes the Eucharist. And he brings out bread and wine. And it's a banquet. It's actually the Passover that he's going to transform. So he takes the bread and he changes it into his body and says, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you." And then he changes the wine into his blood. This is the blood of the new covenant in me. And then he tells the apostles, the first bishops of the church, "Do this in memory of me." And the church has been doing it ever since. So this is the great messianic banquet that has been prefigured way back in Isaiah. It's not the complete feast. That will happen in heaven. But it's an important step along the way. And here we are, ready to partake in the rich feast of Jesus Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity. But this is a difficult teaching. It was in Jesus' day. It still is today, because I think the majority of Catholics, surveys tell us, don't even believe this, let alone the rest of the world. But in Jesus' day, as we remember in the discourse of John's Gospel, chapter 6, when Jesus teaches about the Eucharist, the people say, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" And many walk away. So to prepare the people and to prepare us as well to increase our faith, Jesus performs this great miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. Now, the people have come to hear the wisdom of Christ that was prefigured as part of this banquet. They're there all day. They're listening. They're so enthralled that they forget to bring food. And now it's late, and the disciples ask Jesus, "You should send them away so that they don't faint, and they can go home and get some food." But Jesus is going to have none of that. He says to his apostles, "You give them something to eat." We can almost imagine the panic setting forth on their faces, because they have no idea how that can happen. But no need to panic. Jesus is present. And after all, the wine had run out at the wedding feast of Cana, and Jesus provided. And he'll do the same with the bread. Now, in the background is the prophet Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4. If you remember, Elisha was the successor of Elijah. And Elijah was one of the most powerful prophets of the Old Testament, miracle after miracle, even raising someone from the dead. But when he gives his ministry to Elisha, Elisha asks for double his power. And in fact, if you read 2 Kings, you see all the miracles he produces. Well, one of them is that he changes 20 loaves, barley loaves, to feed 100 men with some left over. That was a tremendous miracle. But he's just prefiguring Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the new Elisha, and Jesus will change 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed 5,000 with 12 baskets left over. And that number 12 is significant. It doesn't only mean completion or fullness, but it's a reference to the gathering together of those 12 tribes of Israel, the people of God, us. There's 2 points of interest here in this great miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. First of all, Jesus says, "Let the people sit down on the grass." And we think, well, why would he say that? It just seems like a throwaway line, useless detail. But there are no useless details in the scriptures. It's a reference back to Psalm 23, the Psalm of the Good Shepherd. "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Now that's what Jesus is referring back to. Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and he's going to provide for his people. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod and your staff will guide me." And then the psalm says, "And he will prepare for me a banquet, a table, my cup overflows." Again, a prefiguring of this great messianic banquet that we are partaking today. The second point in this great miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish is the words Jesus uses when he multiplies the bread. He takes it, blesses, breaks, and gives. Now those are words he will repeat again at the Last Supper, where the actual change will take place, the transubstantiation. It's the words that we use at Mass. So Jesus is deliberately preparing the people for this great superlative miracle of his body and blood. And here we are. That's why these readings are such good news, because the Eucharist prepares us for eternal life. Jesus says, whoever eats my body and drinks my blood has, present tense, eternal life, and I will raise that person up on the last day. So it's all pointing us to the Eucharistic banquet in heaven, where there will be this great feast that Isaiah talked about way back in the 8th century. And the saints have been speaking about it ever since. So St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, says, quote, the Eucharist is our medicine of immortality, the antidote to death. What a summary. So with that good news, let us be encouraged and struggle on. Not just struggle on, but rejoice that God has indeed provided this banquet for us. It's a banquet of great joy. And so let's continue to pray that others will come to the banquet. That invitation is still open, and we are now called to be the agents of this banquet and invite everyone to come because of what we are experiencing in it, renewed life.